Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Starting Line Church. We are so glad that you are here. Before we get started here, Dalton, I've called upon him to hand out some activity sheets for the kids. They actually go with the message today, so you get to follow along and figure out what we're talking about. But we're excited because we are in our third week of our series called Thriving in Babylon, which is a study on the book of Daniel. And so we have dove into all kinds of different parts of this book so far. It's a really unique experience and book as we get to see Daniel and his friends in exile, and we get to watch them stand up for their faith in God time and time again. We get to see how we get to learn how to hold fast to our faith when we. It's not easy to, and it's easy to give up and give in. We get to figure out how do we get to thrive when we are in a place where we don't think that really we're able to or it's possible to. If you were here the last 2 weeks, you know that the Babylonians, they invaded Jerusalem. They took with them their brightest, most sharpest, and most charismatic people as exiles into Babylon with them back into their land. We ended our message last week with Daniel chapter 2, when God, he gives Daniel the ability to interpret dreams, interpret King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And because of what happens, the king is blown away by this gift. He's blown away by what Daniel has done, and so he promotes him along with all of his friends to be administrators in the province of Babylon. But unfortunately, King Nebuchadnezzar's kindness didn't really last very long, and we transition into Daniel chapter 3 today. And as we do that, we see that he's up to creating many more problems for the Israelites. What we learn today as we begin is that the king creates this massive statue completely made of gold. It is 60 cubits wide and 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, which is equivalent to like 96 feet tall and 9 feet wide. So this thing was huge. It was massive. We don't necessarily know like what the statue was exactly. Some say that it was the king himself. Others say that it was just another type of statue or god that the Babylonians would have worshiped that was common at the time. And so regardless, right, we know that this was a physical reminder to the world that King Nebuchadnezzar, he was in charge. He was in charge. He ruled the world because, as you could imagine, like there weren't many objects this big, let alone statues this big that were set up in the country of Babylon for all to see. So the king, he decides to set up the statue and plan this ceremony to dedicate it, this thing that he created. And it was this whole big to-do, right? He had people playing music. He summoned all the important people in Babylon to be there, from the governors to the officials to the advisors. And he told everybody that as soon as people heard the sound of the music play, that was their cue, right, to fall down and to worship this image of gold. That was the moment that they were supposed to bow down to the statue and commit themselves, right, to the king's reign and to the king's power. We may be thinking, like, what the heck? This is like a little weird. Like, what's going on here? But honestly, like at this time, this was very common because there were many different gods and many different things that the people in Babylon worshiped. That was in their minds, this would have just been like, it wouldn't have been any problem, kind of just like adding another one to whatever the king said we were worshiping this time. So all this is happening, and let's be real, like even if people did have a problem with it, like no one in their right mind was ever going to challenge King Nebuchadnezzar. Nobody was ever going to counter this demand. Because not only was he scary and temperamental and threatening and all these different things, but he actually threatened that whoever didn't bow down, whoever didn't worship this statue, would immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Seems aggressive, like to us. It is. Like that's who he is. That's who he was. Now, when we say furnace, we're not talking about like a small little oven, right? Cooking dinner or heating the house. This was a huge industrial furnace that would have been used for all kinds of big things, like making bricks, making metal, probably forging together this statue made of gold that he just made. It says that the temperatures were so hot that when people just walked by, they would be killed. That's how hot it was. And so these people, no one in their right mind would have ever dared, to challenge this thing, to go, oh gosh, that's the threat. Okay, we're not doing that. Until Daniel's 3 friends came in. We know them from the last couple weeks, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you were here in week 1 of this series, we talked about how those actually weren't their real names. When they got to Babylon, they changed their names to make sure that their previous names were not anything to do with the God of Israel. And so their real names, if you remember from our first week, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. However, we're going to refer to them how they referred to in the story today so we don't get confused. So we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 8. This is what it says. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments." That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. All right, we're going to stop there for a second. So these magicians and enchanters and fortune tellers, they see these men refusing to worship this man-made statue. They refuse to put their allegiance to anything else other than God, then into these officials in Babylon. And so these guys, they tell the king about what's going on. They tattle on them. They say, hey, there are people that are not obeying what you want. These were the same magicians and fortune tellers from last week that could not interpret the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has. And so Daniel kind of, comes in and shows them up a little bit. And so they're still salty. They're still mad about all of that. And so they come and they're like, man, these guys, these friends of that Daniel guy, they're not doing what they should be doing. Do you think this went over well with King Nebuchadnezzar? No. We pick up reading in verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up?" I don't know about you, but if I were them, this would be the moment where I'd be like, nope, not true, not true. That's, nope, they're lying. So these men, they're not trying to cause a scene. They're just trying to go about their lives. They are given another chance to change their mind. They could have easily said, nope, we'll worship the statue. It's fine. But they said again, no, we're not doing this. And as you can imagine, they stuck out like a sore thumb. The king, we see this word rage. He's filled with rage. He's losing his mind. He's so upset. He's because of this, his demands are unreasonable. His pride was out of control. His reactions, they're so extreme because all he was interested in was himself, He's like, there's no way I have a rival. How could anyone not want to worship what I want them to do? In fact, in his mind, there couldn't have even been a rival. That's not even that wasn't even, he didn't even understand that. And so what I find, in this story, what I find interesting is that as it intensifies, with every moment, the tension and the anger and the fear, is all rising up. But while all that is getting greater, so is the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who never wavered in what they believed. And in verse 14, King Nebuchadnezzar gives them one more chance to change their mind. This is what it says. "I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you." I love that. "If we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." I love this image. Right? They're communicating that worshiping other gods, like, that's never going to be a thing. That's never going to be in the cards for them. That's never going to be what they're going to do. And they can say though with confidence, like, God can rescue us. He is able to do that. He is powerful. He is almighty. He is able to rescue us from this furnace. But even if he doesn't, we won't regret it. Even if God doesn't save us from this furnace, we'd do it again. Friends, that is faith. And at this news, King Nebuchadnezzar is so furious that his face becomes distorted with rage, and he commanded the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than it usually is. And they tied him up, and they threw him in, and they said, "Good luck." And this is what it says in verse 24. "But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, 'Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them in the furnace?' 'Yes, your majesty, we certainly did,' they replied. 'Look, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire, unharmed. And the 4th looks like a god.' Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out of here.' So they stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not even touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke." This is amazing, right? Like, we can realize that. Like, these kind of stories in the Bible, like, they blow us away, right? Where God just makes a way when there is none. Like, there is no way, and God makes one. When God does something that, like, only he can do. Nobody else can do it. God can do it. When he shows up and does something, like, miraculous like this. This is amazing. But what I don't want us to miss this morning is the faithful response and the very intentional choices of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that led to this victory. Because if I had to guess, as a human being, as they were, I would say that those decisions were probably the hardest decisions they've ever had to make in their life. So we're going to talk about 2. Number 1, they chose obedience over comfort. They chose obedience over comfort. Like, I don't know about you, okay, but I love to be comfortable. I love to be comfortable. Like, I love to put on my favorite sweatpants, right? My favorite hoodie, relax on the couch, watch a TV show, eat a good snack. But I realize, right, even though that's comfortable, I cannot do that 24/7. I mean, I guess I could, but I shouldn't do that 24/7, right? Like, I have things to do. Sometimes we got to get up. We got to do our stuff. We got to step into things that aren't comfortable. In our story today, right, this was not the comfortable thing to do, obviously. The comfortable thing to do would have been to bow down to the image, right, go to sleep, and wake up the next day. The comfortable thing to do would have been not to draw attention to themselves and to stay under the radar, right, so they didn't stand out. I mean, honestly, think about this. Like, these men, they could have bowed to the image, convincing themselves that God knew their hearts. They could have worshiped the idol and then asked God's forgiveness later. They could have convinced themselves that what they were doing wasn't really that big of a deal. Or that God surely would understand the situation here. They could have made excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse to save their life, but they didn't. How do I know that? Because that's what we do with God. We do the same thing. We make excuse after excuse after excuse. But they, made this choice to say, God, we trust you. And even if we die serving you, that's okay, because you deserve our praise and our praise only, right? These men who love God decided that it was way more important to be obedient than to be comfortable. Number 2, they chose faith over fear. In King Nebuchadnezzar's mind, I want you to think, okay? Try to picture as much as you can this furnace. This was not just a random thing. It wasn't just a meaningless punishment. The purpose of the furnace was to instill fear. It was to instill intimidation. It was to show everyone that if anyone even thought about challenging him, they wouldn't. They would quickly change their mind because they were so afraid of what would happen to them. Fear is a motivating factor for people, and the king knew it. Right? As humans, we all have fears, right? That some of us have more fears than others. Some of us have different fears than others, but we have fears that encourage us and discourage us to do certain things. We all have fears that sometimes even dictate how we live, right? It dictates the decisions that we make. I mean, as I look at this story, I'm just real here. I don't think anybody in this room or on the planet can convince me that these men were not afraid. They didn't wake up that day and say, you know what would be really, really fun? To be thrown in a furnace today and die. Nobody they didn't wake up and be like, that is what I want to do. That is on my agenda today. No. I know it doesn't say they were afraid, but I think it's safe to assume that they probably were. They're human beings, right, for crying out loud. What's my point here? It's not that fear didn't exist. It was that their faith was stronger than that fear. So even with their lives on the line and the consequences of being killed in a matter of seconds, it didn't take them long to decide that they were going to pay whatever price might be demanded of them. It didn't take them long to decide that they were going to be faithful to God, regardless of what would happen. As we know, life sometimes doesn't make sense. Sometimes things don't go the way we think they should go or we want them to go. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego experience this. Right? They're in a foreign land with pressure on every side. But they model for us 2 very intentional choices when it would have been easy to give in to what everyone else was doing. Right? They chose obedience over comfort, and they chose faith over fear. Friends, don't miss this. Those things did not come naturally to them. They were conscious decisions that they decided to make. So my question for us today is, what are you facing right now that you need to choose obedience instead of comfort? Or what are you experiencing right now that you need to choose faith over fear? Or what will you face later that's not going on right now? What are you going to face later that you're going to need to remember this story and these 2 choices that they made? Because my prayer for us is that we would have the courage to make these choices, right? We're human. We all desire to be comfortable, and we all have fear. That's just inevitable. We're human. But my prayer for us is that we would decide obedience and faith when we experience those things. Not if, when. Because even though it may not be easy, it will help us thrive in the way that God has called us to be. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you are a God that is so powerful and mighty. that your kingdom reigns. You are the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. And so, God, we just pray that you would allow us to, one, see that you're the same God today that you were in the furnace all these years ago. God, we serve the same God of Daniel. You haven't changed, and you never will. And so, God, we just pray that we would have the courage in our lives to step into obedience and step into faith when we want to naturally choose comfort and fear. We love you, Jesus. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen. What I want us to do is just take 1 or 2 minutes, and there's going to be 2 questions on the screen. I just want you to think to yourself as we kind of transition into this next thing. You don't need to share it. Just think to yourself, talk to God about it. What are these things that I need to process and take with me? Let's do that together.